Good morning, everybody. This is Patricia Zurita. I go by Dr. Z, and this is part 3 of a seminar that I'm doing with Made of Millions on acceptance and commitment therapy and exposure response prevention for OCD and all forms of anxiety disorders. If you have any questions, any comments, any curiosities, feel free to just text them on the chat. I am going to be looking at them as I present. And of course, feel free to just ask anything that you're curious about. And just as a recap, right, we already had 2 presentations on the same topic. In part 1, we covered about all the messages we receive about how to relate to worries, fears, anxieties because of our upbringing, because of the place that we grow up, because books we have read. And I also talk about how important it is to develop a new relationship with thinking and a new relationship with any form of fear-based struggles. Because when you are practicing acceptance and commitment therapy skills blended with exposure response prevention, it's very important that more than getting things done and just approaching your fears, you are stepping back and really checking how this is important to you, how you want to relate to thinking in general, given that the mind is all the time going to come with all types of content, up and down, left and right. And also our mind, as a pattern-making machine, is going to be connecting all types of things, the past with the future, the present with the future, you name it. So when you're thinking about acceptance and commitment therapy skills and exposure, it's also important that you step back a little bit and check how you are related to thinking in general. In part 1, we also talk about values exercises. I share with you 3 different ways that you can figure out what's truly important for you in different areas in your life, in your relationships, in your career, spiritual life, in other areas too. And also we talk about how you want to be checking if you are organizing your life around your fear-based responses. Are you organizing your life based on your obsessions, fear, worries, and panic? Or are you organizing your life based on what matters to you? We also talk about ruling thoughts. All of us, we have been socialized with different ways of responding to fear. But sometimes some of these fears, these ways of relating are not random thoughts, are like more like ruling thoughts because they're we get stuck on them and we hold them with white knuckles. For example, a ruling thought may be, because I think so, it makes me so. If I have this image of this thought about being a pedophile, then with a ruling thought, I may say, if I have this thought, that means I'm a pedophile. Or if I have the thought, what if I'm a serial murderer? Holding into the ruling thought will mean that maybe I am a serial murderer. Another ruling thought will be, because I have the thought a lot of times, it means it's important. Now, we know that there are so many and thousands of thoughts a day that we're experiencing. So it's impossible that all of them are important. But holding into a ruling thought, like if it's repetitive means it is something, make us actually prone to organize our behavior in regard to fears. We also talk about how you can practice some of these acceptance-based skills by watching your thoughts. You can sing your obsessions, you can sing your fears, you can make fun of them, you can respond to them. There is a different set of defusion exercises that you can use to relate to all types of content that your mind is coming up with. You can visualize them, you can again say them aloud, you can physicalize them. Sometimes you may want to make a simple gesture of saying, okay, here is my thought, here's my obsession, right? And just putting on your pocket. Now, in part 3, I am going to focus specifically how you can blend acceptance and commitment therapy and exposure response prevention to face these fears, how you develop exposure menus, how do you decide where you're going to start when you are facing your fears. Let me just go to the next slide. Okay, so what you have here are, let me switch here so you can see better. There we go. So I think that's better. So what you have in this slide are the basic principles that I want to share with you that are going to guide you in how to face your fears. So the first one, it says, you face your fears, worries, anxieties, and obsessions towards your values. One of the uniqueness of blending ACT and ERP is that every single thing you do is in the service of your values. So asking yourself, why is this important to me? In which way facing this fear is going to help me to be the person I want to be, are the key questions that you always want to be asking yourself. There is a difference between facing our fears just because the therapist says so or because a workbook recommends to do that, right? Versus checking, this is important to me because I want to be able to connect with others. I want to be able to be present with others. So every single thing we do about facing your fears is always towards your values and towards being the person you want to be. You develop a values-based exposure menu. You may be more familiar with exposure hierarchies. Within ACT, and we are capitalizing the latest research on exposure, so we invited to actually, more than thinking in hierarchies, like first I do this, then I do that, you can think about all those areas in which your obsessions, your fears, your worries, your anxieties are narrowing your life, and you're not doing things that you want to be doing, or you're not hanging out with a person that you want to be hanging out, or you are not taking trips. So your values-based exposure menu captures all those activities, all the people, all the situations that you are not approaching because of the fears. So we invite you to jot them down, and I will show you some examples how you can do this. The next item is, the next principle is, you mix up your exposures into obsessive, situational, and imaginal. So the idea here is that when you are developing your values-based exposure menus and you're thinking about the exposure practices that you can do, you can mix them up using your body. We call that interobsessive exposure. It can be like jumping up and down, shaking your head, doing some abs. You can do some situational exposure, which is basically approaching a situation. If I am afraid of taking elevators, I may go to a building that has an elevator. If I'm afraid of spiders, I may go to an area where I know there are going to be spiders. And imaginal exposure is visualizing the situation that you're scared of. So when you're developing values-based exposure exercises, you can mix them up, you can combine them. You don't need to have, I only do situationals or I only do imaginal. So in order to practice, to see with the discomfort that comes when approaching your fears, it's important to just mix them up to the best you can when it's doable. The next principle is, you choose when, how to, and for how long you're going to face your fears. This is also very, very important because facing our fears is really hard work and it's brutally scary many times, right? I know for me, I have a collection of fears. And if someone tells me, well, Patricia, you have to sit with that for 1 hour, it's like, oh my gosh, why do I have to do that? So my invitation here, going back to this principle, is that you always have the freedom to choose how long you're going to approach that particular situation or activity or object or image that is scary, when you're going to do it, and think about that it's always in the service of your values. So more than having these items like, I will be sitting in discomfort for 5 hours, or I won't do this for 3 days, right? I want to invite you to check with yourself if you are willing and open to say yes to the yucky stuff that comes when facing this particular fearful situation, activity, or object. So more than getting exposures done as something that you check from a list, it's about checking if you are open to see with the discomfort that comes. But that's really a personal choice. So of course, the whole work of doing exposures is about getting out of your comfort zone and approaching, right? But this idea of just throwing yourself just because is not so helpful, or powering through things, it's not so helpful. It's so much more powerful to actually always check the decision you're making in how you're going to face these situations, for how long you're going to approach them, and why you're going to do them. The other principle is, as I was saying, you make a decision to face your fears because it matters to you. And this is something unique and powerful, I think, across exposure therapy in general, but particular in ACT, because again, every single thing you're doing is in the service of becoming the person you want to be, showing up to your relationships as you want to show up, being the kind of friend you want to be for others, being the kind of partner you want to be. And when you are embracing your values, there is going to be some moments of fear, some moments of stuckness. So when you're developing your values-based exposure menu and you're thinking about exposure practices, please go back to check again that being the person you want to be is also making a decision to sit with the yucky stuff, to sit with the discomfort. And the other invitation that it's here is inviting yourself to have the willingness to get out of your comfort zone so you can be the person you want to be. The way that I think about it is that when we think about willingness, we think sometimes that it's this abstract thing. But I think about willingness as a behavior and as a personal commitment that you do towards yourself, towards your life, the life that you want to live. And especially when facing your fears, no one can make that decision, right? So the idea here is that you always have to remember that you have a choice of for how long, when to face your fears, but you also have to decide how to sit with that discomfort that comes under your skin when you're facing those fearful situations. So these are the principles, the most general principles that I will invite you to have in the background of your mind when you are developing your values-based exposure menus, when you are practicing your exposure exercises. Okay. So just to recap a little bit, this is part of a conversation I had with a client of mine years ago. The idea here is that when you're approaching exposures and when you are doing everything in the service in your values, we're going to invite you to turn off any form of avoidance you have been doing, right? We're inviting you to actually be curious and see what shows up and how it shows up. When we're facing our fears, all types of things could happen, even in your body, right? You may have tingling sensations. You may have sometimes your heart may beat fast, right? You may have a tingling sensation in your stomach. Your legs may be shaky, you name it. The idea here is that when you're approaching exposures, we're not approaching them with a particular outcome, right? About having less anxiety or that a bad thing is not going to happen. We're approaching them with this curious lens to see how it goes and be open to see and experience that. You are the one to choose where to start, right? I will go over this again. When you have your values-based exposure menu, more than where you start is which item or which exercise you have made the decision to face. We're invited, if you're dealing with OCD, we're going to invite you to turn down some of those compulsions. And I know that can be really hard, but also everything starts with you making this decision that facing your fears comes with turning down the avoidance you're doing and also turning down the compulsions you may be doing. I am going to invite you also to hold lightly into all those ruling thoughts because I think so, it makes me so. If I think a lot, it means it's important. Not doing anything about this obsession, it's the same as causing it. So we're going to watch them, those ruling thoughts in the background of our mind. I am going to invite you to always link your exposures to your whys, to your values, to how you want to show up in life. I'm going to invite you to mix them up. Again, you're going to mix exposure practices with your body, using your body, going to a situation or with an image. And I'm going to invite you also to stay present with whatever shows up when you're approaching your fears. And by being present means that describing what you're noticing in your body. You can describe what your mind is doing, saying things like, here is my mind coming up with this obsession. Oh, my mind is coming up with this, disaster forecaster thought. And the next idea here is to vary them up. It means that just try to mix again where you're doing your exposures. Again, these are the principles that are super important to hold when you're ACTifying your exposures. Okay, And what I am going to show you now are, I think I have 2 or 3 examples of values-based exposure menus. And this is something that you can do on your own, or this is something that you can work with your therapist if you're working one of them. The idea here is when we are developing values-based exposure menus, we're mapping a little bit what are the core fears you're having, what are the triggering situations, what are the safety behaviors or compulsions you're doing, and what is the avoidance stuff you're doing. For example, for this client, this is just an example again of a fictitious client. The fear is about getting a skin infection. There is this fear about being contaminated and gross and dirty. The different triggers are using bathrooms, clothes, towels, dirty clothes, touching shoes, touching the floor. The safety behaviors including compulsively washing hands, hand washing at work, wearing long sleeves. The avoidance was touching any items after using the bathroom, avoiding touching doorknobs, for example, in the office. And then when you are developing this, I usually like to add this item that it's about what are the consequences of doing all this in your life. Why this is important? Because remember, in ACT, you're approaching your fears because it matters, and we know it's hard work. And we know that this is keeping you stuck in your life. So when you're developing these values-based exposure menus, it's sometimes helpful to map a little bit what's really happened. What starts an obsession, a fear, or a panic sensation? How you handle that? What are the safety behaviors you do? What are you avoiding? What are the compulsions you're doing, public or private compulsions? And how it affects your life, right? So that's what you write in the consequences of your life. And then I invite you to write why this is important to you. What are your values that you're going to hold when approaching all your fears, right? Again, with this, in this example, it's being present, being approachable, being independent, being honest. And as you remember from part 1, when we talk about values within ACT, we're talking about these ongoing qualities that we want to embrace in life, and we think of them as verbs, right? Because we're always working towards our values. Living a values-based life is not something that we say, check, I'm done, I was approachable today, and now I can go to take a nap. It doesn't work too much like that. We're all the time working towards being approachable, towards being kind, towards being gentle with ourselves, towards being a supportive partner with the people we love, right? So the values usually are, again, these ongoing qualities that you want to embrace in your day-to-day life, and you're always working towards them. And then what you have next, we come up with ideas. What are the ways in which you can approach these fears towards your values? And this is what is super unique and super cool of blending ACT and ERP. So, for example, if I'm afraid of spiders, one exposure with other models may be simply holding the spider on my hand, or getting close to the spider, or watching movies about spiders, which is how exposure is done. With ACT, we're augmenting a little bit here how you can get in contact with spiders, but doing something that is part of your life. For example, if I am a mother and I have 3 kids, and my kids love to go camping, but I'm a little bit scared about going camping because of the spiders, maybe one exposure exercise will be taking my children for one-day camping trip, right? Or going with my children to the park and playing hide and seek, or playing another game where I can count the spiders. So the exposure exercises are starting points of things that you want to do more in your day-to-day life. So they are connected with that. And of course, right, if needed, you can do so much more complex exposures, right? But when you are starting thinking about approaching your fears, my invitation is you go back to the situations you are avoiding, you go back to the situations that are triggering for you, and see which ones of them you can build in your values-based exposure exercises. For example, in this chart, what you have, one of them was driving the car without showering because I want to be independent, right? So remember that in the example, this person has fears of contamination. So showering before driving a car that the family was using was a way of, it was a safety behavior to minimize any type of contamination. Now, it's part of, this person's life to be driving every single day, right? So the exposure was around that, about a daily activity that this person can take, can participate in. Another item was doing my own laundry. So as you can see, the items are here activities and situations that you do in your day-to-day life, right? So I think that is very important when you are considering approaching your fears. So here is another example, and this is, and I think this is helpful because in my humble experience, one of the things that I notice is that when my clients are dealing with fear-based reactions, whether that's OCD, social anxiety, panic disorder, trauma, it's not that they are coming with one particular fear-based response. I think it's more like the fear-based responses may have overgeneralized to other areas. For example, you may have fears about contamination of aggressive obsessions or sexual obsessions, and you may also be dealing with fears of making a fool of yourself, a fear about fear of being the center of attention, fear about making mistakes, right? So a person may have OCD and may have social anxiety, or a person may have OCD and may have chronic worry, or a person may have panic disorder and may have OCD. So the reason for that is that fear-based responses can easily get reinforced, right? Because of avoidance and because of safety behaviors and compulsions, and they can affect so many areas of our life. So in this example, what I try to show is how you can approach them if you are dealing, for example, with fears, with social anxiety and with OCD. Your core fears will actually, you can capture your core fears for both of them. What are your fears related to the obsessions? What happens if you don't do that compulsion? What happens if you don't do the avoidance? And what are your fears about the social domain? What are your fears when you are avoiding so much talking in public or giving a presentation? So fear of making a fool of yourself, fear of being a pedophile, fear of harming others. And then you also list your triggers for both and all the core fears, right? Fears about social performance and fears about related to obsessions. Then you jot down the compulsions and safety behaviors you're doing for both of these fears. The avoidance behaviors that you're doing also for both fears. So what I'm telling you here is that your values-based exposure menu could incorporate all types of fears. No, you don't have to have like 5 different types of menus. One values-based exposure menu for social anxiety, another values-based exposure menu for obsessions, another one for panic. You can actually capture all of them in a single process, because facing your fears, you're going to be approaching them as they come in your life. So you can actually blend them. And then when you are considering values-based exposure exercises or ways to approach these fears, you can also mix the items of these exercises related to all your fears. For example, what I have in the slide is if I'm afraid about people judging me in a negative way, one way to handle this will be by approaching others, even though my mind tells me I'm bothering them, so I can be genuine, right? Or if I'm afraid about causing harm to others, as in obsessions, I can ask my boyfriend about car accidents during the day, so I can be more present with others instead of being distracted in my head, right? If I'm afraid about being a pedophile or harming children, I may offer to take my nieces and nephews to the zoo so I can show up to my family with love. Let me show you another one. So if my fear is again about being the center of attention, not being liked by others, as you may see sometimes in social anxiety, one example could be replaying text to my friends with short text, so I can see with the discomfort of not knowing whether people like you or not, so I can be more genuine. So when you are thinking about these exposure exercises, notice that at the end of the activity that you are thinking of, that you're considering, you're also having this other piece. What's the values? What is this in the service of, right? So instead of saying things like, I will eat an apple or I will hold a spider, you may want to add the next part, right? If I hold a spider, this will help me to be blah, blah, blah. That's super important. So you will always have this values-based exposure menu as a roadmap about how you're going to be approaching these fears, and having this reading will help you to remember that it's all on the service of your values. And what you have here is another example about how you can mix different types of exposure, like imaginal exposure, right, coming up with an image, situational exposures, situations, activities you may be struggling with, interoceptive exposure using your body. For example, what I came up with this for this exercise was, let's say that you are afraid about contracting stomach cancer and skin cancer. So after you have identified your core fears, after you have listed all the triggers, right, that they start actually this obsession, you have written your compulsions on safety behaviors, you have identified the avoidance, the values-based exposure exercises may blend these different ways of doing exposures. For example, one activity could be exercising 4 days a week for 60 minutes each day to practice self-care, right? So that will be like an interoceptive exposure because you're actually doing exercises. And in this example, when doing exercises, that triggers some form of discomfort on my stomach. So facing that discomfort while doing exercises, that will be very consistent with how this person wants to show up, right? By practicing self-care, by doing some exercises. Another item here will be volunteering at a hospital in a neighborhood so I can be compassionate and gentle with myself and others, right? That will be more like a situational exposure, right? And towards doing something that is important for this person. The other one could be smelling a strong scents. That's also interoceptive exposure, right? So I can practice sitting with a body discomfort and I can connect with others when I'm interacting. So again, the idea here is that you can mix them up, the ways in which you are approaching your fears. And if you're dealing with fears related to OCD, to social anxiety, you can also combine them. You don't need to have a values-based exposure menu for each one of these struggles or for each one of these core fears. You can put them together. Okay, now this is one of my favorite slides, and I will tell you why. One of the very common questions I get from my clients when I'm working and helping them to get unstuck from any fear-based reaction they're having, they usually ask me, how do I approach these fears? What do I need to do? And for years, I spent time thinking about how can I translate that beauty and the power of ACT skills in a way that is accessible to people. So what I'm sharing with you is something that I use it in my work, and I call them the wise moves, which is just another way to refer to exposures. But that caveat here is that when talking about wise moves, each one of the letters is a prompt for you to relate to thinking, to relate to fear in a way that will help you to maximize the exposure you are doing. So let me walk you through that. And of course, if you have any question, please just text it on the chat. I'm just keeping my eye on that. One of the things that I mentioned at the beginning in part 1 is that you can read hundreds of books on ACT, and every book will have super cool exercises. And if you have a look at social media, there's a lot of posts about different ACT defusion skills you can do, or exercises, or metaphors. And that is super cool. But I think ACT, more than being a technique, is a way of relating to your fears, it's a way of relating to your mind, and it's a way of relating to yourself as a person you want to be. So it's important that when you're holding these principles, you always keep that in mind, that it's not about getting done with exposure. It's about building the skill of stepping back and watching what the mind is doing. So W stands for that, watching what your mind is doing. And there is a difference. If I have a thought, let's say that I am afraid of making a fool of myself with this presentation. There is a difference if I write down on a piece of paper the thought, and I just bring it close to myself, and I look at everything from this thought, versus holding the thought on my hands, holding the thought in my lap. Now, because of this context, I cannot do a lot of experiential exercises, right? But notice here that there is a difference between watching my mind from the thought, as if it's there, versus learning to have the thought. So when approaching your fears, you may want to check, what am I doing right now? What is, am I just watching my mind? Am I watching the thoughts? Am I watching what's showing up in my head? Were you consumed by it, taking it as the absolute truth? The I stands for inviting your obsessions. And that sounds a little bit funky, I guess, right? Because therapists were always, or exposure therapists were going to tell you, sit with the obsessions, make room for them, don't fight them. But inviting your obsessions maybe is an easy way for you to remember that your task is to even say, hi, here is the obsession. Here comes my obsession. Here comes my horrifying thoughts. Here come obsessivist abilities, if you are going to be a little bit silly with those obsessions, right? But inviting the obsessions and simply saying that they are coming, saying hi to them, saying, here's my obsession is kicking in. Why this is important? Because when you are acknowledging the obsession by saying it, here is my obsession, here comes this thought, here comes this fear, you're making room for them in a very low-key way. You are actually starting to practice some of the acceptance process that you're going to need to face your fears, right? The S stands for staying with your experience, which, as we know, this is super important in any exposure form, in any exposure model you have been exposed to. Notice that. Clearly, I love the word exposure. Staying with your experience, what I am suggesting here is to describe the sensations that are showing up in your body when you're facing a fear. Saying things like, my heart is beating fast, I'm having this strong urge to run away, I'm having more saliva, I have this urge to blink my eyes so I can neutralize my obsession. Again, staying with your experience is describing what's showing up in your body as it is, right? The moment that your mind tells you, this sucks, this is awful, I don't want to feel this, you are back into fighting and wrestling with these obsessions. And remember that our task is to make room for them by acknowledging them. So the I, inviting your obsessions, you can acknowledge by saying, here comes the obsession, here comes this fears of contamination, here comes horribilis abilis, if you come up with a scientific name for your obsessions. Staying with your experience is describing what's showing up in your body and give that a name with a feeling, right? I am noticing the anxiety, my heart is beating fast, I'm having shortness of breath. When you're doing that, you're helping your brain to recognize what you're going through. And actually, when you do that, it helps your brain to also step back a little bit versus being so consumed trying to solve this problem of what's showing up when you're facing your fears. The letter E stands for either torch or away. Why this is important? Because many times when we're facing our fears, sometimes we may go into this backward into mode and just get it done, right? Or even may feel like, you're being tortured. But remember that this is a decisional process you're making for yourself to face the things that are important to you. And when you are approaching your exposure exercises, whether that's holding a spider, or talking about spiders with your kids, or cooking vegetables when your kids are around and you are afraid about stabbing them, right? Or going to do a volunteer at a hospital, even though you're afraid about contracting cancer. So when you are doing all types of exposure exercises, it's important to remember that how you handle them will take you either close to be the person you want to be, or it will take you away. So that's something that you can even ask yourself, right? Okay, am I remembering I can make a choice? And then the M starts for making a choice. More than making the right or the perfect choice, my invitation for you is to make the choice as a decision that you are making. And there is not going to be the perfect or the right choice, right? I think, again, facing our fears can be really, really hard. In the ideal world, you will always say no to my compulsions, not to my avoidance. But we're humans. And facing our fears sometimes is going to come with some degree of learning to decrease our avoidance crutches. But I will invite you that to keep in mind that as long as you make a decision, that's always a good step, because then you are in charge of how to face these situations. So if it's not ideal certainly, but if you do an avoidance behavior here and there, or when you are facing these fears, more than torturing yourself and criticizing yourself, or maybe telling yourself that you did exposure wrong, I will invite you to remember that you made a choice. And that's the skill that you want to build. That when you are approaching all types of fear situations that are going to pop up in your life, you remember that you have this capacity to choose. It just happens that sometimes we forget that we can choose because we're so consumed with our worries and problem solving and trying to get rid of them, right? So remember that wise moves, each one of these letters is a prompt for you to remind you how you can face your fears when doing exposures. So the E is, again, remember that you have a choice, and the M stands for making the choice. And the O stands for observing what comes with the choice. When you are facing your fears and you're making this as an intentional decision you are making, and you are making this as a process to say yes to the yucky stuff that comes when we are facing our fears, see what happens. Quite often, I have seen my clients approaching exposures to get rid of the anxiety, minimize anxiety, to not ever have those obsessions, and to be done. The challenge is that, let me break big news for you here. Wherever we go, there are going to be things that scare us. It's just the nature of being alive. We are wired to experience fear, and it happens that different situations that happen in the world are going to trigger that experience. So this idea of being done with exposures and I'm done with my fears, right? It's not too consistent with how life shows up to us, right? You can be very successful and very effective overcoming the fear of contamination. But in 10 years, when you are raising your kids, you may have a different fear. Or when you are changing jobs, you may have a different fear. So wherever we are, as long as we're breathing, there are going to be things that make us be scared. So my invitation is, instead of thinking that this is another thing that you check off, remember that our task is to watch what happens when we are approaching what we are scared. Why this is important? Because you don't want to get hooked on an outcome of having less anxiety, less obsessions, and be done. You want to really develop the muscle of watching what shows up under your skin as it is. Because remember, when we are experiencing emotions, even the most uncomfortable emotions, they usually don't last too long. Emotions are going to last sometimes between 90 seconds to 2 minutes. But what happens that makes an emotion last longer? We're dwelling on the emotion. Why I'm feeling this? I shouldn't be feeling this. We're judging the emotion. This is bad. This sucks. Every time we go into this is bad, I don't want to feel this, or we're ruminating, why am I feeling this? That makes the emotion last longer, right? So observing what comes with the choice, say, noticing, okay, I'm noticing that my heart is still beating fast. I'm noticing that my shoulders are not so tense as they were. I notice my mind is telling me that, okay, this may be okay. So observing what comes with a choice is really describing anything that may showing up in your head, in your body, and with your emotions without any attachment to a particular outcome. Valuing your choice basically means really giving yourself a pat on the back because you just did one of the most courageous things that we have to do every day, which is facing our fears. The reason why this is important is because in my work and in my life, I know that facing the things that we're scared of, it's not easy peasy. It's hard work. Sometimes it's tricky. Sometimes we get stuck. I can tell you that I know it's extremely rewarding to face our fears because amazing things happen our way and because there is something powerful about being every day the person that we want to be and showing up to others, that the people we love, as we want to show up to them. However, we forget that sometimes when this process of facing our fears is not a perfect process. In fact, it gets messy. It's hard because it gets, we're facing the yuckiest feelings that we can face. So appreciating that and valuing that you just faced one of those fears and that you did your best in the moment, super important. Don't let your mind play tricks in criticizing yourself, in which you didn't do enough exposures, you didn't do the exposures right, which for some people, sometimes those can be indicators that they are dealing more with meta OCD, obsessions about the obsessions, right? So when facing your fears, valuing your choice means giving yourself a pat on the back. Acknowledge that in that moment, you were doing your best, and this is hard work. The next prompt is engaging what is next. Sometimes that I have witnessed many times in my work is that once we approach an exposure, after your therapy or after you're reading a chapter on a book, right? Or after this webinar, you may be spending hours about all the hundreds of exposures you're going to be doing and how you did it and how you even do right this exposure. Remember that you do have a life to live. And within that, exposure is the means towards a values-based life. Exposure is not the end goal, right? We really want to help you to get back into your life and make the best of it while making room for all the annoying stuff that may come up. But there is always life happening next to you. For example, let's say that you are watching a movie with your friends and then you are just having a fun time. You're having popcorn, you're kind of laughing with the movie. Hopefully you're watching a good movie so you can laugh, because we never know these days. And while you're doing all that, then there is a thought that pops in your mind. You see the image of a naked children, right? And then you follow this. You say, okay, here's my mind coming up with this image. You can say that to yourself. I'm noticing my heart's beating fast. I notice my shoulders just got tense, right? You are staying with experience. You're discovering what you're feeling. And you can do this privately in your head, right? And you're making a choice that maybe you want to engage with what is in front of you with watching the movie, right? See how it goes. Sometimes your mind may come up again with another obsession. No, doing this right? But remember that you don't have to answer to the obsessions that come up, right? If someone texts me right now, let's imagine that your obsessions are like texts coming on my cell phone. I don't have to answer that because I'm more invested right now in this webinar, in this presentation, right? So I may imagine that I'm facing my obsessions as I'm facing the cell phone down, so I cannot see them, right? And then what's next is to do my best to put my attention on the movie. I may actually do an extra effort to notice what's happening in the movie, the colors of the movie, the special effects they are making, right? Or I may decide to have a delicious piece of popcorn, right? And I will just, eat slowly. There is always life happening for us in front of us. My invitation is that after you watch your mind, invite your obsessions, stay with your experience, make a choice, right? Give yourself the freedom to choose, exercise that muscle, watch what comes with the choice, value your choice, engage with what is next, continue moving. Now, I know that is super hard. Usually the feedback I get from my clients is like, by Dr. Zurita, my mind keeps coming, one after another thought, it's hard. Remember what I'm telling you, that facing our fears is not something to check off from the list and I'm done. It's a process, as in any process requires commitment to keep doing many times over and over. The Dalai Lama doesn't have a perfect practice, a perfect meditation practice. He gets stuck up and down, left and right many times, and he talks about it, right? So just to get a reference that this idea of re-engaging in life with what is next, when your mind is coming up with blah, 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 all types of thought, it's not going to be easy, but it's also not impossible. If you remember to practice these wise moves as prompts, and you practice the skill of refocusing again with what is in front of you, you are going to be building this muscle. And the last letter S stands for soften up with self-compassion. Why this is important? Because I have witnessed hundreds of times with my clients how they actually can get very criticizing and harsh with themselves, right? The challenge is that sometimes because facing their fears is hard, they may not be able to do it. And then they say, oh my gosh, I didn't do my exposure, I'm a bad person. Or if you're dealing with these taboo obsessions like aggressive obsessions, fears about being a pedophile, fears about being a serial murderer, fears about suicide, right? Or metaphysical OCD, or fears about harming others, right? That comes sometimes with a lot of shame, and it's scary. A woman that just delivered her baby, right, that's supposed to be excited about being a mom, and then she has this image and this fear about harming the baby and doesn't want to be with the baby. And is scared about telling the husband about it, is scared about telling the partner about these fears, is scared about telling the doctor. So when doing exposures, all those things show up. Your urges to get reassured, the fears about facing these fears. And sometimes the exposure, because it's not easy, may not go as you would hope it will be. That's why being open to what comes is important. But also to remember that beating yourself up is not helpful. Beating yourself up will make it worse because it keeps your brain in a threat mode. And we do want to help the brain to slow down a little bit. So self-compassion will activate the areas of your brain that are soothing, that will help yourself to regroup and keep moving on with your life. So even though it feels like a foreign concept sometimes to be talking about self-compassion, although there is so much literature right now about it, I have found that it's super powerful to add it in the process of facing our fears. And I'm going to pause right now because there is a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me just check 1 second. Yeah, so there is one comment that says, my OCD has turned into existential dread. I feel it's not worth living because there is no God and so no purpose of life. When I was religious, I was very extreme. And now when I'm not religious or atheist, it's also very extreme. This is also OCD, I believe. Certainly it could be OCD, right? There is this fear about not living up to the rules or the religious beliefs that you're supposed to live, right? And there is this fear that if I don't believe in God, then I'm doing something wrong, right? Remember that obsessions sometimes can be very sensical, like, am I in love? Am I living up to God's standards? Am I living my faith as I want to be? But then also they can be very, very nonsensical, right? Can I steal this person's knowledge by looking at them, right? And my boy, could I become the character of that movie, right? So obsessions can vary in form and shape, right? But what makes an obsession is that it's a sticky, you cannot let it go, you cannot move on with the rest of your day because of it. It makes you doubt many times who you are and what are your values and what's really important for you, especially if you're dealing with existential OCD, right? So just something to catch, that there is a difference to have reflections of life, as we all have, but obsessions have that sticky quality, right? And again, it's hard to let them go, but also they can sometimes make you doubt who you are and what is important for you. Let me go to the next one. Okay, so the wise moves gives you the frame to approach your fears, and again, are those just prompts that will remind you of different micro skills you can do when facing your fears. But in a nutshell, if I have to summarize core skills to face your fears, you have watching your mind. I think this is super important, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself here, but I really want to emphasize ACT is not just a set of techniques and skills that you can be doing. ACT invites you to develop a new relationship with your mind. You don't have to have 15 years of practicing meditation and being in a quiet room all the time. You can develop a new relationship with your mind right now as things are coming your way. And you can start noticing if you're watching the thoughts, or if you're being consumed by thoughts, or if you're taking every single thought serious. In the case of OCD in particular, many times my clients, they say, I don't know, if that question is really asking for reassurance, or it's just, a curiosity I have, right? So if you don't know, I would invite you, wait 24 hours and see what happens with the feeling, right? If you can manage to wait 24 hours, it's quite likely that it was just more one of those strong urges to do a compulsion that was kicking in. But developing this new relationship with thinking, it's super important. Riding the wave of emotions, this is important because when we are facing our fears, we're going to have all types of emotional noise coming our way, and we know that it's not easy. And sometimes doing this comes with a lot, like high intense emotions, right? Like the elephant size, right? Sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes you may have maybe like an ant type of emotions, like a small wave in the ocean. But when riding the wave, it means that it's more important for you to try to describe what you are feeling than getting caught in what's the meaning of the feeling, because that's not going to be helpful. Or judging the emotion is going to prolong the emotional state, right? So remember that riding the wave really comes with describing what you're sensing in your body, what you're feeling. And sometimes when that's hard, you may want to ground yourself. And you can ground yourself in so many ways. For some people, it's very grounded to simply place one hand in their stomach, take a deep breath, push the air all the way. They can ground themselves in that way. And that helps them to continue describing the emotion. They can also ground themselves by dropping the anchor and by pressing their feet really hard on the floor so they notice the tension, and that helps them to bring back into what they are experiencing. But the main idea here is when you go into judging the emotion, you're not riding the wave. You're actually making it longer. When you're going into trying to not have that emotion, you're not riding the wave. You're making it longer. So watching your mind and learning to just watch those emotions as they come in your body. You can even tell yourself, or you can even check with yourself, if the emotion were to have a color, which color will that be in your body? Is the emotion moving, or is it localized? Is it only in your upper body or in your lower body? And practicing acceptance moves, this is also important because in your life, sometimes, quite often, we're going to get triggered. We're going to get triggered to do something that will help us to have the life we want to have, or is going to take us away. So sometimes you're going to have a chance to do more these planned exposures, right? When you're making a wise move intentionally for, let's say, in the moment, it's a planned exposure. But other times, life comes with a trigger. You can go to watch a movie, and then the movie is about a serial murder, and maybe you didn't know, right? So in the moment, you may want to practice some acceptance moves by prompting yourself, right? Saying things like, I will do my best to describe this feeling. I want to be able to sit with this feeling. Notice that acceptance prompts are not about getting rid of the emotion, but making room for that. Sometimes you may have to have these micro prompts to be able to manage the moment in an effective way. And I also invite you to track all the shift moves that you're making. And the shift moves, I'm referring to these wise moves on the sense that even if it's in a tally sheet, right, when you actually keep track of the situations, people, and objects you have been approaching because they are important to you, it will help you to remember that you're building the skill of facing what is scary. So something to think about, right? We try to develop a new relationship with our mind, with thinking, with our fears as a life skill, because wherever we go, we're going to experience something that scares us. You remember to use your wise moves, and that can be in a planned way, right? Based on your values-based exposure menu. And when life comes and you are in the street, or you're talking to your friend, or you're talking to your kids, and you get triggered, you can practice writing that way. Describe again what you feel. And you can use some micro prompts to remember that you can accept that experience as it is. And then at the end of the day, or once a week, you can track, the things that you have been approaching, either planned approaches or on the fly. Going to go to the next. So this is something that I do with the clients I work with, but also I do it in my own life. I really think that life is different when we are taking action towards the things that matter to us. And this is something that for me has been extremely impactful in my life as Patricia, and as a professional, and as a friend, and as a partner. So there is this values dashboard, and you can do that in so many ways. This is just an example, right, of how you could do it. In the values dashboard, you can have different areas of your life, like health, work, relationships, spirituality, personal life, you name it. I will invite you to not have 18 areas of your life because that will make it hard, right? But maybe just 2-3 areas to start that you want to focus on. And then when you write is the values-based exposure, the values-based exposure practice that you're going to be doing, right? So those are the numbers 1 to 3 and when you're going to be doing. And again, the idea here is that it's easy to forget that we are facing our fears as a process, because sometimes the mind tells us you're not doing enough, right? Or you didn't do it right, or you're not doing anything. So when we are tracking, we're actually also building this reflective capacity to check, how am I facing my fears? How I'm handling them in my life? And this is just an idea. You don't have to do it this way. I know the way that I do it in my whiteboard, every single month, basically I have there's a little area in my whiteboard when I have 3 areas of my life that are important. I think it's relationships, career, and personal growth. And then I have a line when I check, when I'm with the values I'm doing, right? So at the end of the month, I check which area of my life didn't have many marks. So I try to do that the next month. And what I can tell you is that it has given me direction and reminders to do the best I can to be the person I want to be. So any tracking you use when you're facing your fears, please do so, because it will help you also to reflect in your process. And also, when you are approaching your fears, whether that's in a planned format or it's more like impromptu, it's more on the fly, I will invite you to reflect, right? Remember that facing our fears is another skill that you're practicing. And it's not that we were born with the skill of learning how to face our fears, right? We're actually learning how to do that. And reflecting about how we handle them is going to be helpful to continue building the muscle, right? So what you have here is the questions that you could ask at the end of every exposure that you encounter or that you plan to face. For example, did I watch my obsessions or did I get hooked on them? And remember that watching my obsessions is, I can look at them as Time New Roman font, big size, right? They can be in colors, or I can imagine them, or I can watch them as letters that are printed in the label of that kombucha I'm having, or I can imagine my obsessions as subjects of an email that I got, or I can imagine them as messages on the cell phone, right? So I want to check, or did I get hooked on them? And hook means I took all my thoughts seriously, right? I was like, this could happen, right? That's not watching. So helpful to reflect. The next question you may want to ask yourself, did I make room for my obsessions? And making room, again, remember, is saying, here comes the obsession. I am having the thought. My mind is having this thought about I may stab someone, right? Helpful to check how you're handling the obsession. You can ask yourself, did I stay with experience, right? When you're staying with experience, you're describing what you're feeling in your body and and the feeling you're having. So you can check, right? Did I fight that? Did I judge the emotion? Did I judge the feeling? Did I remember I chose, right? Sometimes we forget. Sometimes we just go in automatic pilot mode and go with the old behavior. So you may want to ask yourself that. You may want to ask, did I make a choice? What was my choice? And remember that the most important thing here with this question is to build the capacity of choosing, which is different than going in automatic pilot mode. And no one better than you to choose. And the next question is, did I observe? Did I watch? What came up when I make this choice? Did I value with self-compassion? And valuing your choice could be things like, I did my best. I know I try harder. And then did you engage with what is next, right? Did I move on with the next activity? And then the S is missing there is like, how did you soften up with self-compassion? Sometimes what I tell myself is that it was hard. I did my best, right? I just want to be gentle right now. How can I be gentle with myself right now? So asking yourself these questions after every time you're facing exposure is going to be helpful to develop more flexibility with these fearful situations that come your way and with your thinking in general too. And close to the end, I want to invite you that approaching our fears, whether that's obsessions, worries, fears, panic, it's not something that we get it done. It's something that we face in our life day to day, moment by moment. But nothing better and nothing more important than learning from the experience. We won't learn to face our fears by thinking about them, by overthinking about them, by analyzing the exact exposure and the perfect exposure I have to do. We're going to learn how to handle our fears by approaching them. And you're always in charge of how you want to face them, for how long you want to face your fears, how you're going to do it. But remember that the biggest learning is going to come from your experience, not from overthinking it. And there we go. And I also want to invite you to remember that workability trumps accuracy. What do I mean by this? When you are dealing with OCD, this is sometimes like an overthinking problem, right? It's that if I think so, it means that. If it's repetitive, means it's important. Not doing anything about it means that I cause it. More than getting consumed with those compulsions, with those figuring out ways, with those ruminations, with those trying to find the right exposure. Remember that what works is every step that you're taking towards your life. So workability is about making a choice to either move towards the things that are important to you, being the person you want to be, or doing things that actually perpetuate a cycle of fear-based struggles. So more important than doing what works than being right or holding the truth, especially when you're dealing with obsessions. If you have more questions about these presentations or the series, by all means, you can go to one of the websites, thisisdrz.com, and you can send me an email, or you can go to other website. It's called playingitsafe.zone. There is a section that I did for my client's request. It's called Ask Dr. Z. You can send me any questions you have. The last time before the webinar, I did ask for your input and I received 57 questions, which is super great. So I tried to address some of them in both presentations, but I may have other lives to go and clarify some of them, but you always have the freedom to reach out and ask me any other question you may have. And now that I am done with the presentation, I am just going to take a look to the chat box to see if any of you have any questions or any curiosities or anything that you would like me to cover next time. For the next presentation, the last one of this series, I am going to talk about the things that keep people stuck facing their fears doing values-based exposure exercises. Today, you got a frame about how you want to develop your values-based exposure menu, how you can start with some values-based exposure exercises that are related to your values and to your day-to-day life, how you can put into action wise moves as prompts about to face different moments of exposure, and how, if you're dealing with different types of fears, you can put all of them in a single values-based exposure menu, right? So if you're dealing with OCD and social anxiety, you can have still a values-based exposure menu. Remember that you want to mix up the ways that you do exposure. You can mix situational exposures, exposures with your body, exposures with your imagination. You can do it in different settings too. Can be at home, can be at work, can be in a park, right? And you can start in a values-based exposure menu in any item that you're willing to face in the moment. And if that's too hard, you can start with a maybe low intensity item, the item that is less scary for you. So let me check here if there is any other questions. I'm glad that it was helpful. Thank you so much for participating. I know sometimes it's hard to make some time to participate in these webinars. A couple of people sent me an email and asked me, is it going to be recorded? And yes, the webinar is recorded. You can go to the YouTube channel of Made of Millions, where they have amazing presentation. And this one is going to be recorded. For part 4, I will see you in September. I will send you an email as well, and we will announce it in social media, so please stay tuned. But if you have any other questions, please send me an email. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much, and I wish everyone a great day, and please stay safe. Bye-bye.